Chapter 7, Africa. As you can see, we're going to attempt to talk about the entire continent of Africa. So obviously, this is going to be touching on just a few of the numerous cultures there in Africa, and just kind of touching on one or two small elements of each. So this is a very quick overview of Africa. Religion in Africa. Again, because we're talking about a large land area, a lot of different influences, we have a lot of different religions. Most have a creator god, though typically you don't see the creator god being depicted or referenced. It is usually petitioned through intermediaries. Most of the gods or spirits have to do with the natural world. And the ancestors are very much integral to the religious experience. Christianity has existed in Africa since the 2nd century. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church was established in the 4th century by King Ezana. And in the late 15th century, Christianity was introduced into sub-Saharan Africa by the Portuguese explorers and traders. Islam came to Egypt after 640 and then spread below the Sahara in the 8th and 9th centuries through traders and scholars. On the coast, Arab and Persian colonizers introduced Islam through the beginning of the 8th century. For the most part, these religions coexisted, or certain elements were kind of taken and modified from these various religious groups. Religious practice in Africa centers on a desire to engage the spiritual world. Objects are used by diviners to attract and tap into spiritual forces. The objects are not necessarily powerful in and of themselves, but they're activated through ritual offerings. Let's start looking at some of these pieces. These are masked Kanaga dancers from the Dogon peoples in Mali, West Africa. Now, one of the things about the African cultures you're going to notice is that when things are meant to be used and then they're meant to decay and go away. We saw that with the Polynesian. So these are things that are not necessarily meant to last forever. They tend to be made of natural materials, wood, grasses, things that normally would decay and not last a long time. Kanaga masks are worn at rituals called Dama. These transport the souls of deceased family members away from the village. So what we're talking about are these masks up here. But if you just take the mask off, this kind of taking away because the whole outfit is part of it. Okay, so we have a double barred cross, as you can see, with short vertical elements. So we've got basically a cross here with two cross beams with these little short vertical elements coming off. So the head itself is covered, as you can see, with the part of the mask. And then we've got some fringe and things surrounding. We have a vest made of black strips of woven cloth and red strips embroidered with white cowrie shells. Not necessarily in this picture, but that is the typical outfit that is worn with these masks. The trousers, as you can see, these are indigo dyed cloth. And then we have a grass skirt over top of that. The grasses are dyed in reds and yellows. Okay, so back to the mask. That can represent, on one hand, it represents a bird with white wings and a black forehead. On the other hand, it also has to do with God or creator figure. The crossbars being his arms and legs and representing his control over the universe. Another possible interpretation is it representing the sky, the top bar representing the sky and the bottom representing the earth. So we've got possible interpretations of this. The ceremony is organized by members of the Awa, which is a male initiation society with ritual and political roles in the Dogon society. There are more than 80 different masks that are used in the Dhamma performances. These other masks depict various animals, birds, objects, and even abstract concepts. Performances take place over a 6-day period. A procession of masked dancers escort the souls of the dead from the village where they might cause harm to their final resting place in the spiritual realm. So here's a couple of other examples of these masks. Again, we've got this kind of a cross-like, so we've got a beam here, these two crossbars, and then these short elements. So as you can see, it can definitely reference a bird. You can also reference a figure with arms and legs, and it could again represent the sky and the earth. So there's lots of things it can represent. So one of the things that you're going to start seeing is some glass beads on some of these masks and things. So glass. Glass actually arrives in sub-Saharan Africa from the Middle East and India as early as 200 AD. We've got the expansion of the Roman Empire is hoping to broaden trade patterns. Also, the introduction of the camel as a means of transport. Both of these things are helping to move goods easily from one part of the globe to the other. And so we've got these glass, primarily glass beads that are entering into Africa, and they're starting to use them in their native outfits, dance costumes, etc. And so we also have a glut of them coming in the 15th century because we have all of these European countries coming over to try to claim their part of Africa. So we've got Portugal, Italy, Bohemia, and then the Dutch, English, French, Belgians, and Germans. And by the 17th century, the Dutch have a very huge role in this area. And so they actually have a monopoly on glass beads in Africa by that 17th century mark. So we have all of these European countries coming in, trying to claim the land, and in the process bringing in some of these European wares. African art and artifacts go back over to Europe starting in this time period, and they start going into private collections and museums, and they are starting to influence artists. And so this is an example of Pablo Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, the Young Ladies of Avignon. It's widely regarded as very influenced by African masks that he would have seen at museums. However, this is Picasso, and so he definitely did not like to share any thought that he might have gotten influenced by anything other than just his great mind. He had a very big ego, and so he always denied being influenced. But obviously, we can see that these two figures' faces very much look like masks. And these are a couple of examples of Picasso's pieces compared to some strikingly similar African masks. So you can see here the obvious similarity, whether he liked to think it or not. So let's go to South Africa. Let's start out with some ancient piece here. This is scene of men taking on eland features as they approach a dying eland. This is in the Game Pass shelter in Camberg, Natal, Drakensberg. First of all, what's an eland? Eland is a the largest of the antelope species. They were very important to the San, that was the people there. They believed that they had supernatural powers. So, just like in cave paintings, the idea is that maybe when you paint these creatures on these walls, in this case a rock, that maybe you can capture their essence or make it so that they can be killed more easily. And so, again, this theory kind of rings true here as well. Here are, these are still in that same area, but you can still see some more elands. They are accessible, as you can see in this picture, by humans. So we've got some people and some elands there. And that's what an eland looks like in real life. All right, so let's go to Great Zimbabwe, the Great Enclosure. Great Zimbabwe, this is an area that was inhabited from the 9th through the 15th century. We've got the Great Enclosure. So we have a series of buildings. This is thought to be part of the ruler or the king's house or palace. The Shona people are the ones that built this. They had come from the Sahara Desert and migrated south. We have flat granite slabs, and they were dry stacked. That means that there's no mortar in between there. We have curved walls around houses of clay and wood with thatched roofs. Great Zimbabwe was the largest enclosure group and the capital of the Shona Kingdom. It was the home of the king, and these walls were 23 feet high. There are over 6,000 houses in town at the bottom of the hill, and about 18,000 people lived here at the peak of the time. The Great Enclosure, that particular building, is considered to be either the queen's residence or a temple. Could be a granary. Again, there's questions of what the purpose was. It is a magnificent piece of architecture, though. The country took the name Zimbabwe in 1980 after Rhodesia won its independence in 1965, in case you're curious where that comes from. All right, so we actually have a lot of different areas here. So I want to kind of show you some of these other areas as well. So we have things like the hill ruins, valley ruins, as well as the Great Enclosure. So that's what this is. And so in the Great Enclosure, there were living quarters, a community area, and this very high round tower. You're wondering why is this no longer a place? Around 1450, the capital was abandoned because the land couldn't furnish food and the city became overpopulated and the area around it deforested. In 1505, the Portuguese settled in the area and the region was divided between rival powers of the kingdoms of the Torwa and the Moen Mutapa. However, archaeological excavations have revealed that glass beads and porcelains from China and Persia, as well as gold and Arabic coins from Kilwa have been found, and so we know that it was a widely well traded with city. Give you a kind of an idea of the scope here. The Great Enclosure was 328 feet wide, 836 feet in circumference, and it is the largest ancient structure in sub-Saharan Africa. Again, the largest ancient structure in sub-Saharan Africa. That high conical tower we talked about, that is 33 feet high. So that tower right there, 33 feet high. Now we're in East Africa. This is a funerary post. Following a funeral, a deceased might appear to a kinsman in a dream and ask for a new residence. They would then commission a funerary post to be created. Typically, these have naturalistic faces. They're very individualized. They're not necessarily portraits. But then the body is this geometric form. It's often painted with red, black, and white. And you would give these funerary post offerings of coconut oil, chickens, and goats. These funerary posts are sometimes called kikangu, and they can serve as a number of different things. They can be a literal grave marker, but then they can also be a mediator between the world of the living and the ancestors. So this can be kind of a doorway between these two realms. They also serve as a record of the deceased person's life. So while it just looks like a lot of geometric shapes, these oftentimes are meant to reference things in their lives, from the number of wives they had and children, or the number of enemies killed. So these actually have a lot of symbolic meanings. Here are some other ones. They can be 6 to 8 feet in height and 8 to 10 inches in width. Buttons or coins are often used to represent the eyes, while the nose and mouth are typically kind of a rectangular form. These are typically carved from the Nzizi wood, which is an extremely hard type of wood. Sometimes you'll see these circular patterns of triangles, which kind of have a sunburst imagery to them. The kikingu, or funerary post, is often erected over the grave of the deceased. If the village moves, the kikingu is repositioned in a new location. However, once they move a second time, it is typically not moved. The oldest male of the family makes the offerings. It's not necessarily a portrait. And while sometimes it is a literal grave marker, it doesn't necessarily always have to be. It can be more of a figurative piece. So kind of remember that. These are typically only for men and for the wealthy. Here's some other ones, again, to show you kind of a wide range here. Now, Rwanda, 5 miniature baskets. Not much to say about these except for just amazing workmanship in creating these, especially if you've ever done basketry. Creating these very fine, very tight weaves is not easy here. Now we're in Ethiopia. All right, now we're going to talk about the gospel. This is the Gospel of St. Matthew. As I said earlier, we've got Christianity coming into Africa very early on. Egyptian and Syrian missionaries Christianized parts of East Africa between the 4th and the 6th centuries. According to the latest census, about 60% of Ethiopians consider themselves Christians. Of that 60%, almost 44% are Ethiopian Orthodox Christian. Christianity became the official religion in Ethiopia in the 4th century. Orthodox Ethiopians claim that the Bible's Ark of the Covenant is actually housed in a cathedral in Aksum. The Ethiopian National Holy Book, the Kebra Nagast, in the 10th century, an Ethiopian ruler, the Queen of Sheba, traveled to Jerusalem to seek the wisdom of Solomon. So supposedly when they met, they had a son, Menelik, and he became Ethiopia's first emperor. Now, some thought that this was a highly apocryphal story. However, recent DNA tests, because everyone's doing all this new DNA testing now, well, they're actually seeing that the native population had mixed with Egyptian, Israeli, or Syrian populations around 3,000 years ago, which would have been that time that the Queen supposedly, the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon got together. So they're thinking that that apocryphal story might not be apocryphal. The Bible was translated in the native Ge'ez language in the 14th century. This is an Orthodox Christian community, so their Bible is a little bit different than ours. The biblical canon of the Tewahedo Church includes 81 books, which is 46 books of the Old Testament and 35 for the New. includes books such as Enoch, Jubilees, and 3 books of the Maccabees. There is a broader canon that some Orthodox Christians accept, is not as popular. It includes books such as the Epistle to Clement, the Josephon, and 2 books of the Covenant. So this one is the Gospel of St. Matthew. We have St. Matthew being portrayed here in a decidedly African way. We have very geometric shapes of his body and on his clothing. We also have colors that we see in other elements in Africa. But here are some other examples just to kind of show you what some of these other ancient Ethiopian Bibles look like. Still depicting the biblical stories, but much more in an African styling. Gotta love the wings here. Love these wings of these angels. Definitely influenced by the birds there in Africa. Here's some more. Again, so you have African people being depicted in these biblical scenes. And this is actually a piece that we have at the museum. I thought you might find this interesting. So this is Christ on the cross, crucifixion, but it is definitely in an African style. And so I just think it's actually just this great piece that we have that the face very much references African masks. Again, in this African styling, but still has the message of Christ on the cross. Now, in Central Africa, we have a staff handle, a mvula. Now, some of these tribes that we're going to talk about are matriarchal and some are patriarchal. So some have the women in authority, some have men. So you can never just automatically assume either one here. This is a beautiful piece carved out of ivory. Ivory is very popular medium in Africa because of the elephant, so it's readily available. So let's talk about Chibunda Ilunga, or the civilizing hero. You can use either one, civilizing hero or Chibunda Ilunga, whichever you prefer. So he is a mythological ancestor, priest, hunter, hero. He is depicted as a powerful man with large hands and feet. He has a royal headdress, long beard, oftentimes shown with a staff or a gun. He is part of the Chokwe people group in the Republic of Congo. Who is Chibunda Ilunga? He is a son of a great Lumba chief, Wood Luigi, and a chieftainess. He taught the Lunda the art of hunting and became a great ruler. He represents this archetypal chief, like the best kind of chief. Maintains the well-being of his people and serves as a role model for men in the Chokwe society. So we've got this headgear, we've got these rolled side elements there. We've got a staff in one hand and a antelope horn in his other. The Chibunda Ilunga, again, there's many of these. So what are some of the common elements so you'll be able to recognize others? Typically, they're going to be made out of wood. They're going to be on the smaller side, usually between 10 to 20 inches. They have large hands. The large hands represent power. They have large feet. The large feet represent the ability to walk long distances. They have broad facial features, large eyes, Massive shoulders that are thrown back, knees bent, as you can see here. We have a long beard, typically of real hair, which is a symbol of aristocracy, muscular body, and then the headdress. We have this upturned, flaring headdress, two lateral wings that curve back, and then horn rises from the cap and bends backward. So this is a very kind of typical headdress that you would see with Chibunda Ilunga. What does he carry? So there's a couple of different things that he can carry. And again, it kind of depends. So as I mentioned, a gun, a staff that you see here, hunting charms. They're oftentimes suspended from a strap across his chest or at his waist. We have the antelope horn that we can see in this one right here. The antelope horn would typically be full of medicines to protect the hunter. Sometimes a tortoiseshell, again, full of magic medicines. And a hunter's belt, which would have an ammunition box, gunpowder, and a machete. And let's look at another example. We see here, we've got the medicine horn, the antelope horn here. We've got the staff, and we've got that wonderful headdress. And the big hands, big feet. Nikisi Nkondi, or hunter figure. Again, Democratic Republic of Congo. This is kind of an interesting figure. The priests use these figures to hunt for solutions to village problems and to search for wrongdoers. So this is meant to solve legal matters, sometimes counsel married couples, control the destructive powers of nature, and protect a village from enemies. So you name it, it does it. This is really a tool to kind of go between our world and the other world, as well as to fix problems. It can be used to resolve verbal disputes or lawsuits. It can also be used to counteract sorcery or evil. These are wooden figures. They're carved under the divine authority and in consultation with a spiritual specialist who activates these figures through chants, prayers, and preparation of sacred substances. The priest, when he receives and gets one of these special figures, puts medicines and fetishes in a container either at the top of the head or in the stomach. And we see the stomach area in this one here. And these fetishes can include relics of dead ancestors, bits of clay from the cemetery, or other things that might be connected to this other realm. Oftentimes, the stomach area is shielded by a piece of glass or mirror or other reflective surface. Again, this has to do with the other world, the spirits of the dead. So it's literally this the mirror or the barrier in between these worlds, these realms. And so in order to activate this figure, we typically would, the priest would pound in, as you can see, a nail or other metal object. This would be used to help initiate whatever incantations that he has done. It can also be a way to bind yourself in kind of like a signing on a contract. If both parties go to the priest, they can both pound in their nails, and this is as good as a signed contract. They would lick the blades or the nails first, and then pound them in. And so the licking means that just kind of like you would see in the movies where you would cut the hand and have the blood co-mingling. The movies love kind of doing that kind of thing. Well, it's kind of the same idea. So your saliva, and it's kind of it's binding you to this. to this thing that you are doing through the priest, whether it's a marriage contract or what. It's the way that you are bound to this. If a client asks a priest to unleash the power of the hunter, they will swear an oath before the figure and thrust a nail or a blade. And when I talk about blade, is typically a very kind of small piece of metal. Here's a couple of other pieces you can kind of see. And you can see there's different kinds of pieces of metal in this one. And you can use them, as you can see, you can get them all filled with pieces or have some, but there's that hole in the stomach area again. If an oath is broken by one of the parties who has inserted their nails or their broken pieces of metal, then the Nikisi Nkonde will become activated and carry out its mission of either destruction or divine protection, depending on what the motivations are. Also, if the purpose of this was to reach out into the other realm to contact a dead ancestor, typically that's whenever you get the bits of clay from the cemetery to put that in that center area, and so then the priest can help communicate with the other world there. Here are some other ones, can give you an idea. These are actually pretty large figures over here. And then this one's actually in the shape of a monkey, which I thought was interesting. All right, now we go to West Africa, Nigeria, and the Nok people. So now we have a nice little map so you can see where we're talking about. All right, so we're going to be talking around 500 to 200 BC. These are modeled and fired clay sculptures in central Nigeria. Some characteristics of Nok sculptures. We have triangular or D-shaped eyes, holes in the pupils, elaborate hairstyles. They typically represent ordinary people. The Nok culture appeared in Nigeria around 1000 BC, but then vanished around 300 AD in West Africa. The Nok culture was created the earliest sub-Saharan life-size terracotta figures. These typically are hollow, coil-built, and typically have life-sized human heads and bodies. Now, we don't know exactly why they created these. So, one of the theories is that these are ancestors. Another is that these are grave markers. These can also be kind of charms to prevent crop failure, infertility, or illness. Some even speculate that these were used as kind of decoration for various structures, that these would be put on the roof lines like the Etruscans did. This is the coarse-grained clay, as you can see here. If you are a potter, you can kind of see how coarse it is. They were covered with slip and burnished. Figures, as I said, are hollow. Now, this culture actually had kind of disappeared for a long time, but it was rediscovered in 1928 on the Jos Plateau during some tin mining operations. One of the miners found a small terracotta of a monkey head, and then others started finding human heads, feet, and other body parts. In 1932, a group of 11 statues were discovered near the city of Sokoto. And then in 1943, near the village of Nok, in the center of Nigeria, several new clay figures were found. A worker who had actually found a head and taken it back to his home for use as a scarecrow, actually for a whole year, until finally word got around to the director of the mine, who came around and purchased it from the worker. They were able to find over 150 pieces in this area. And so they were able to find these great heads. We've got deep round holes for the pupils, triangular or circular eyelids, mouth open, no teeth, This is kind of a pretty typical NOC figure, and this is head of an Oni king. All right, so this is a seated figure. This is a Yoruba figure. This is a beautiful example in copper of a figure from the Yoruba peoples. It typically would have something like this would have probably been placed on a low throne and dressed in vestments, kind of clothing that would have been worn by the leader it is representing. This is the ruler Aro Wayoe. And you can see his very elaborate outfit here. So we've got the elaborate crown, scepter, his garments, and even his part of his throne there. The crown is emphasizing the head, the central place of power. He shares power with mothers or witches, which are represented by the bird heads on the crown. This is, again, in the Yoruba peoples. These Yoruba crowns, most are cone-shaped, as you can see here. And it is fully beaded. Beads are considered to be sacred. This type of crown is limited to just a small number of kings or obas that are descended from royal families. The beaded veil that hangs down is a very important aspect of this, and it downplays the king's identity as an individual while reinforcing his role as a divine leader. So the idea is not that this specific person, not John Smith is the leader, but he is the king, as his position is. The faces on the crowns represent and honors ancestors. Typically you will find Odudawa, the mythic founder and first king of the Yoruba people. Birds have to do with the realms of the human beings and spirits, this being able to go between the spirit world and our world. Birds also represent female power. The mother, which is the nurturing aspect, and the witch, which is the destructive aspects. And so, not to get too much into it, but in African cultures, the women definitely have this dual identity between nurturing and destructive, between mother and witch. This is a Yoruba priest crown that we have at the museum. So I thought you would enjoy getting to see the intricate beadwork here. So now thought we'd look at this Igungun Yoruba mask. So this has to do with, again, ancestors and the role of the ancestors in the role of the lives of the living. In the Igungun festival, a family is celebrating through masquerades. Igungun priests have the ability to communicate with ancestors and invoke these spirits, specifically during this time, this festival. Ancestors help ensure that the living uphold the ethical and moral standards of the past. The Igungun festival is the most colorful of all the Yoruba festivals. There's drumming and dance, and the dancers are possessed by the spirits of the ancestors. The masquerade cleanses the community through whipping and sacrifices, and bestows blessing upon the spectators and issues warning about impending events. So a little bit of everything. There you see the mask. So the previous mask was one we had at the museum. Here's one with a full attire, so you can kind of see how it's fully worn. The masquerade is performed by the male members of the Igungun families. Women participate in the chorus. The older female members invoke prayers and oversee collections of offerings. The more elaborate the dress and mask, the greater its power and prestige. So you will see that the fabric is oftentimes added on with beads, sequins, and tiny mirrors to make it even more elaborate. If you'll notice, the figure is the person dancing that is wearing that is completely and totally covered. This is so the idea is that this person disappears and it is actually the ancestor in the costume doing the dance. So during this time, during this festival, some Gungans have supposedly had the power to levitate. However, you are not supposed to come in physical contact with an Gungan again during this festival because of this the idea that you are coming in contact with this ancestor, not John Smith. You were coming in contact with the ancestor, and so in order to kind of remove this, you could actually get lashings or even a fine if you do. The word Igungun actually means masquerade. These rituals and festivals can actually last up to several weeks. Again, women and children participate by singing and watching and dancing, but they are kept at a distance from the masqueraders because, again, it is not these people in the village, it is the ancestors that are doing this. In order to create one of these costumes, you would have to work with obviously a tailor for the fabric, a sculptor for the mask, a diviner who can help communicate with the spiritual world, an herbalist who can create packets of protective medicines that are attached to the costume, and of course the leader of the Gungan society who would perform the rituals to sanctify the costume and select the young people who would be wearing it. It is a high personal prestige and really a great honor to be wearing one of these during the festival. One of the trademarks of the Gungan festival is the bata drum, which is beaten without rhythm. So the idea is the masqueraders dance without rhythm. It's kind of an interesting aspect. The Gungan festival typically is performed sometime between November and April, when there is no rain. There are some, again, elaborate costumes. So you can see all of the sequins. And again, there is not an aspect of the person that is shown because it's the ancestor.